The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Clarence's house, creating rivulets that traced down the glass like tears. And Princess Royal sat in her study reviewing the guest list for the upcoming state ceremony honoring veterans of the Commonwealth. Her fingers moved methodically through the carefully typed pages, checking names and protocols with the precision that had defined her royal duties for decades. At 63, and had earned her reputation as the hardest-working member of the royal family. While others basked in the glamour of royal life, she had chosen a path of quiet service, supporting hundreds of charities and attending thousands of engagements without fanfare. Her calendar was always full, her commitment unwavering, and her dedication to duty absolute. The ceremony they were planning held special significance. It would honor veterans from across the Commonwealth, many of whom had served in conflicts that, and herself, had witnessed firsthand during her overseas visits. She had walked through field hospitals in Afghanistan, met wounded soldiers in rehabilitation centers, and comforted families who had lost loved ones in service to the crown. This ceremony was more than protocol. It was personal. Your Royal Highness, her private secretary, Margaret Thompson, entered quietly. Margaret had served for 15 years and could read her moods like weather patterns. Today, something felt different. There was an unusual tension in Margaret's shoulders, a hesitation in her usually confident stride. "Yes, Margaret," and looked up from the papers, her sharp blue eyes immediately detecting the discomfort in her secretary's demeanor. Margaret cleared her throat, a small sound that seemed to echo in the wood-paneled room. "There's been a development regarding the Veterans Ceremony. Her Majesty Queen Camilla has requested some adjustments to the program," and set down her pen, giving Margaret her full attention. The relationship between and Camilla had always been cordial but complex. While and respected the institution of the monarchy above personal feelings, she had never forgotten the pain her father endured during his tumultuous relationship with Diana, nor the way Camilla's presence had complicated those years. "What sort of adjustments?" Anne's voice carried the measured tone she used when dealing with potentially delicate situations. Margaret shifted the papers in her hands, clearly uncomfortable. "The Queen Consort feels that the ceremony would benefit from a more streamlined approach. She's concerned about the length of the program and the number of speakers." Anne's eyebrows rose slightly. She had spent months coordinating with veteran organizations, ensuring that representatives from each Commonwealth nation would have a voice in the ceremony. The program was carefully balanced to honor the diverse contributions of service members from across the realm. "I see. And what specifically does she propose?" "She suggests reducing the number of veteran speakers from 12 to 4, eliminating the individual nation presentations, and shortening the musical tributes." Margaret's voice grew quieter with each word, and felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times when forced to compromise her principles for the sake of royal harmony. But this felt different, more personal, more pointed. "These veterans have been planning their presentations for months, Margaret. Some have traveled from Australia and New Zealand specifically for this ceremony. Mr. Harrison from the Welsh Guards has been working on his speech about his fallen comrades since we first discussed this event." Margaret nodded sympathetically. "I understand your concerns, Your Royal Highness. However, there's more," and stomach tightened. "Continue." "The Queen Consort has also suggested that perhaps Your Royal Highness might consider stepping back from the main ceremonial role. She believes that as Queen Consort, she should take the lead position, with you in a supporting capacity." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, and had organized this ceremony from inception, had personally reached out to veteran organizations, had spent hours reviewing military protocols to ensure every detail honored their service appropriately. She had visited with many of these veterans in hospitals and rehabilitation centers, had heard their stories, had promised them their voices would be heard. "I initiated this ceremony, Margaret. I've spent 8 months planning every detail." "Yes, ma'am. Everyone is aware of your tremendous efforts." Margaret's diplomatic training showed in her careful phrasing. "Perhaps there's room for compromise?" And stood and walked to the window, watching the rain continue its relentless descent. In the reflection, she could see her mother's jewelry box on the side table, a piece that held Elizabeth's favorite brooch, one she had worn during countless ceremonies honoring service members. The sight steadied her resolve. Schedule a meeting with the Queen Consort for tomorrow morning, and said finally, I'd like to discuss these proposals directly. That evening, and found herself in her private sitting room, surrounded by photo albums documenting her decades of military engagements. Pictures of her with soldiers in Bosnia, nurses in field hospitals, veterans at Remembrance Day services. Each photo told a story of commitment. Not just her commitment to duty, but there's the service and sacrifice. Her phone buzzed with a text from her brother, Edward. Heard about the ceremony changes. How are you holding up? And stared at the message for a long moment before responding. Managing. Thank you for asking. But she wasn't managing, not really. This felt like more than a scheduling disagreement. It felt like an erasure of her life's work, her carefully built relationships with a military community, her promise to those who had served. She had attended the funerals of soldiers who had served under her patronage, had comforted their families, had assured them that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the storm having passed in the night. And dressed carefully in her Navy suit, professional, respectful, but unmistakably authoritative. She had chosen her jewelry deliberately, her mother's pearl earrings and the military brooch presented to her by the Royal Marines. Clarence House felt different as she walked through its corridors toward the meeting room. The portraits of previous monarchs seemed to watch her passage with knowing eyes. She passed the small gallery where her mother's official portraits hung, including the one painted after Elizabeth had visited troops in Northern Ireland, her face showing the same mixture of determination and compassion that felt building within herself. The meeting room had been prepared with military precision. 2 chairs faced each other across a polished mahogany table, with Margaret positioned discreetly to one side with her notebook ready. Through the tall windows, and could see the gardens where she often walked when dealing with difficult decisions. Camilla entered precisely on time, accompanied by her own private secretary, a thin man named Reginald who always seemed to hover at the edges of conversations. The Queen Consort looked elegant as always, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her cream-colored suit impeccable. But there was something in her expression, a determination that suggested this meeting would be more challenging than and had anticipated. "And how lovely to see you," Camilla said, her voice carrying the warmth she'd cultivated over years of public engagements. "I hope you've had a chance to review the suggestions for the ceremony." "I have indeed," and gestured for Camilla to take a seat. "I must say, I'm curious about the timing of these changes. The program has been finalized for weeks." Camilla settled into her chair with practiced grace. "Well, that's precisely the issue, isn't it? Sometimes distance gives us perspective. When I reviewed the program fresh, I felt it might be a bit overwhelming for the attendees." And leaned forward slightly. "Overwhelming in what way?" "These veterans have asked specifically for the opportunity to share their experiences. Many have never had a platform like this before." "Of course, and their service is deeply appreciated," Camilla replied smoothly. "But we must consider the broader audience, the dignitaries, the media, the general public watching on television. A more focused program would have greater impact." The phrase greater impact hung in the air between them, and recognized the language of media consultants and public relations experts, the voices that increasingly influenced royal decisions. She thought of veteran James McLaughlin, who had lost both legs in Afghanistan and had spent months preparing a speech about his fellow soldiers' courage. How would she explain that his story didn't fit the new focused approach? Camilla, these men and women have sacrificed everything for their countries. Some have lost limbs, others have lost friends. They've been planning their presentations as a way of honoring their fallen comrades. I'm not comfortable simply cutting their voices from the program." Camilla's expression remained pleasant, and detected a subtle shift in her tone. "I understand your attachment to the original plan, but We must consider what's best for the monarchy as a whole. The ceremony reflects on all of us. The ceremony honors those who served. That should be our primary consideration, and it will honor them, but more efficiently. Camilla opened the folder her secretary had placed before her. I've spoken with the palace communications team, and they feel strongly that a shorter, more focused program will receive better media coverage and public reception, and felt something cold settle in her stomach. This wasn't about efficiency or media coverage. This was about control, about who would be seen as the leader of royal engagements, about whose vision would shape the monarchy's public face. I see. And the suggestion that I step back from the primary role? Well, as queen consort, it would be more appropriate for me to take the lead position. You would certainly be featured prominently, but in a supporting capacity. The words were delivered with diplomatic precision, but their meaning was crystal clear. And thought of the countless hours she had spent with these veterans, the trust she had built with their organizations, the personal promises she had made. Now she was being asked to step aside so that Camilla could receive credit for work that wasn't hers. These veterans specifically requested that I lead the ceremony, and said carefully, I've been their primary contact throughout the planning process. I'm sure they'll understand that royal protocols sometimes require adjustments. The meeting continued for another hour, with both women maintaining their diplomatic facades, while the underlying tension grew more pronounced. Camilla presented her position with the confidence of someone who expected compliance, and listened with the patience of someone calculating her next move. When they finally concluded and felt emotionally drained but oddly clear-headed, she had spent her entire adult life navigating the complex waters of royal duty, balancing personal convictions with institutional expectations. But this felt different. This felt like a test of everything she claimed to believe about service, honor, and keeping faith with those who had served the crown. That afternoon, she called Colonel Harrison, the Welsh Guards veteran who was scheduled to speak about his fallen comrades. Your Royal Highness, what an honor to hear from you directly. His voice carried the warmth and respect she had come to associate with military families. Colonel Harrison, I'm calling about the ceremony. There may be some changes to the program, and I wanted to speak with you personally before you heard from other sources. There was a pause. Changes, ma'am, and closed her eyes, feeling the weight of disappointment she would cause. The program may be shortened. Some of the individual presentations may need to be cut. The silence stretched longer this time. When Colonel Harrison spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, not anger, but a profound sadness that cut through Anne's heart. Understand, Your Royal Highness. These things happen. I'll inform the others. Colonel, please know that this decision doesn't reflect any lack of appreciation for your service or the importance of your message. Of course not, ma'am. We understand our place. After ending the call, and sat in her study as darkness fell outside her windows. The phrase, we understand our place, echoed in her mind. These veterans had spent their lives serving something larger than themselves, accepting orders even when those orders disappointed them, maintaining dignity even when treated with less respect than they deserved. Her computer chimed with an email from Margaret, forwarding the revised ceremony program that had apparently been finalized without her input. As she read through the abbreviated schedule and felt something inside her shift, a quiet rebellion that had been building for years finally reaching a tipping point. She opened a new document and began typing a letter to her father, King Charles. If Camilla wanted to change the rules of engagement and would ensure that all parties understood exactly what was at stake. 3 days had passed since Anne's meeting with Camilla, and the silence from Buckingham Palace was deafening. Her carefully worded letter to King Charles had been delivered through proper channels, yet no response had come, and found herself checking her phone more frequently than usual, a habit that felt foreign to someone who had spent decades operating on the assumption that royal communication followed predictable protocols. The morning brought Margaret with an unusually somber expression and a stack of newspapers. Your Royal Highness, you should see these before the calls start coming in. and accepted the papers with growing apprehension. The headlines made her stomach lurch. Palace sources suggest princess and may skip veteran ceremony due to scheduling conflicts and royal rift. Princess Royal reportedly at odds over ceremony plans. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the articles. Anonymous palace sources painted a picture of and as difficult and unreasonable, someone clinging to outdated protocols while more modern royals try to streamline public engagements. The coverage suggested that her disagreement with Camilla was purely personal, making no mention of the veterans' voices being silenced or the months of planning being discarded. How did this information reach the press? And asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Margaret's diplomatic training showed in her careful response. It appears someone with knowledge of the internal discussions felt compelled to share their perspective and set down the newspapers, her mind racing through the implications. This wasn't just about the ceremony anymore. It was about her reputation, her relationships with the military community, and her standing within the royal family. Someone had decided to wage this battle in public, using the press as a weapon. Her phone rang, displaying the number of General Morrison, patron of the Veterans Association, and hesitated before answering, knowing the conversation would be difficult. "Your Royal Highness," General Morrison's voice carried concern. "I've seen the morning papers. Can you tell us what's really happening with the ceremony?" And chose her words carefully. "The program is being reviewed to ensure it meets everyone's expectations. Some adjustments may be necessary. Ma'am, with respect, these men and women have been preparing for months. They've arranged time off work, planned travel, some have even purchased new uniforms. Are you telling us their presentations are being canceled?" The pain in his voice was unmistakable. These were people who had already sacrificed so much, and now they were being asked to sacrifice again, not for country or crown, but for palace politics. "General Morrison, I want to assure you that I haven't abandoned this ceremony or the veterans it's meant to honor. However, there are forces at work that I'm still navigating." "Forces, ma'am," and realized she was walking a dangerous line. Speaking too freely could be seen as breaking royal protocol, but remaining silent felt like betraying the people who had trusted her. "I can't elaborate at this time, but please know that I'm fighting for the original program. Your veterans' voices matter, and I'm committed to ensuring they're heard." After ending the call, and found herself pacing her study, a nervous energy building that demanded action. She had spent her life following protocols, respecting hierarchies, and maintaining dignity even when treated unfairly. But this situation felt different, more personal, more consequential. Her assistant knocked and entered with a visitor announcement. "Your Royal Highness, Prince Edward is here to see you." Edward entered with his characteristic gentle demeanor, but his usually cheerful expression was clouded with concern. As the youngest of Charles's siblings, Edward had often served as a mediator in family disagreements, his calm temperament making him a trusted confidant. "And I had to come. This business in the newspapers, it's not right," and gestured for him to sit in the comfortable chairs near a fireplace. "I suppose you've come to suggest I compromise for the sake of family harmony?" "Actually, no." Edward's response surprised her. "I've spoken with several of the veteran organizations. They're confused and hurt. These people trusted you, and they've been planning this ceremony as a way to honor their fallen friends. To have their voices suddenly deemed unnecessary." He shook his head sadly. "Then, you understand why I can't simply step aside." "I understand, but I'm also worried about you. The way this is being handled, the press coverage, it feels orchestrated." And studied her younger brother's face. "What have you heard?" Edward hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with sharing palace gossip. "There are whispers that Camilla feels you've become too independent, that your direct relationships with military organizations bypass the traditional palace structure." "And Charles? What does our father think? That's what worries me. I don't think he's getting the full story. The information reaching him is being filtered through Camilla's office." The implications hit, and like a physical blow. Charles had always trusted his wife's judgment, especially regarding royal protocols and public relations. If Camilla was controlling the information flow, Charles might genuinely believe and was being unreasonable. Edward, I need you to understand something. This isn't about ego or territory. I've made personal promises to these veterans. I've looked into the eyes of men who lost their friends in battle and assured them they would be honored. I can't break that faith. Edward nodded slowly. I know. That's exactly why I'm here. What can I do to help? That afternoon, and made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. She called Colonel Harrison back, but this time her message was different. Colonel, I want to be completely transparent with you about what's happening. There are individuals within the palace who believe your stories are too long for the ceremony, that honoring each Commonwealth nation individually is inefficient. They've asked me to step aside from organizing the event. Colonel Harrison's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. Ma'am, are you saying we're being silenced? I'm saying that powerful people believe your voices are less important than media schedules and television ratings. But I'm also saying that I disagree with them completely. What do you need from us, Your Royal Highness? The question caught and off guard. Throughout this ordeal, she had focused on protecting the veterans from disappointment, but she hadn't considered that they might want to fight alongside her. I need you to know the truth, and I need you to decide whether you're willing to accept this treatment or whether you want to stand up for yourselves. We're soldiers, ma'am. We don't abandon our missions, and we don't abandon our commanding officers. That evening, and received an unexpected visitor. Her mother's former lady-in-waiting, Lady Patricia Thornwood, arrived unannounced, requesting a private audience. Lady Patricia had served Queen Elizabeth for 40 years and possessed an institutional memory that spanned decades of royal protocol and palace politics. And, dear, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, Lady Patricia said as they settled in Anne's private sitting room. But I've been hearing disturbing reports about the veterans' ceremony. I'm sure you have. The situation has become rather complicated. Lady Patricia's sharp eyes studied Anne's face with a perception that came from years of observing royal dynamics. Complicated or manipulated? The directness of the question surprised Anne. Lady Patricia had always been diplomatic to a fault. Perhaps both. Your mother faced similar challenges, you know. There were always those who sought to diminish her role, to limit her influence, particularly in areas where she had developed strong personal relationships. And leaned forward, intrigued. How did she handle such situations? She documented everything. Every conversation, every decision, every change in protocol. And, when necessary, she ensured that all parties understood the consequences of their actions. Lady Patricia reached into her handbag and withdrew a small leather notebook. This contains notes from similar situations during your mother's reign. I thought you might find them instructive, and accepted the notebook with reverence. Her mother's handwriting filled the pages, careful records of palace politics, strategic decisions, and personal reflections on balancing duty with principle. One entry caught her attention immediately. When others seek to diminish our commitments to those who serve, we must remember that the crown's honor is measured not by our comfort, but by our faithfulness to those who trust us. Why are you showing me this? And asked, because your mother believed that some fights are worth having, even when they're difficult, especially when they're about keeping faith with people who have served the realm. That night, and couldn't sleep, she found herself in her study at 2 in the morning, drafting a new letter to her father. This time, she included specific details about her commitments to the veterans, copies of their correspondence, and documentation of the planning process. She also included something unprecedented, a timeline showing exactly when and how the press had received information about internal discussions. As dawn broke, and made a decision that would change everything. She called Margaret with instructions that would shock the palace establishment. Margaret, I want you to arrange individual meetings with every veteran scheduled to speak at the ceremony. I want to meet with them personally here at Clarence House. All of them, ma'am. But there are 12 speakers from 7 different countries. All of them. I want to look them in the eye and explain what's happening. They deserve to hear the truth directly from me. Your Royal Highness, this is highly unusual. The Palace Protocol Office will need to approve such extensive meetings. Anne's voice carried a steel that Margaret had rarely heard. I'm not asking for approval. I'm informing you of my schedule for the next 2 weeks. The first veteran arrived that afternoon. Sergeant Major Williams from the Royal Canadian Regiment had lost his right arm in Afghanistan and had planned to speak about the medics who saved his life, and welcomed him into her study, offering tea and biscuits as if he were visiting royalty himself. Sergeant Major Williams, I asked you here because I believe you deserve to know exactly what's happening with the ceremony you've prepared for. For the next hour, and detailed the political maneuvering, the media manipulation, and the fundamental disagreement about whether veterans' voices mattered more than palace convenience. She watched as Williams's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to quiet anger. Ma'am, are you telling me that Queen Camilla doesn't think our stories are important enough for the ceremony? I'm telling you that different people have different priorities. Some prioritize media efficiency over personal testimonies. Williams sat quietly for several minutes, processing the information. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure. Your Royal Highness, what would happen if we veterans publicly supported the original ceremony format? What if we made it clear that we specifically requested your leadership? And felt her heart racing. That would be unprecedented. It could be seen as veterans taking sides in an internal palace dispute. With respect, ma'am, this stopped being an internal dispute when our voices were deemed unworthy of the ceremony meant to honor us. Over the next 2 weeks, and met with each scheduled speaker, the conversations were remarkably similar. Initial confusion giving way to understanding, followed by quiet determination. These were people who had faced life and death situations in service to their countries. Palace politics, while unfamiliar territory, didn't intimidate them. By the end of the second week, something unexpected had emerged. The veterans had begun communicating with each other, sharing their conversations with and developing their own perspective on the situation. They were no longer passive recipients of royal ceremonies. They were becoming active participants in shaping how their service would be honored. Colonel Harrison called, and with news that would change everything. Your Royal Highness, we've been discussing the situation among ourselves. We'd like to request a formal meeting with you to propose an alternative approach. What sort of alternative? We'd prefer to discuss it in person, ma'am. But I can tell you that we're not willing to accept being silenced. We've served too long and sacrificed too much to be treated as inconveniences. And agreed to the meeting, though she wondered what these veterans could possibly propose that would resolve such a complex situation. She was about to discover that people who had survived combat had developed their own approaches to dealing with impossible circumstances. The morning of the veterans' meeting dawned gray and misty, London's autumn weather reflecting the uncertainty that had settled over Anne's life. She had spent the previous evening reviewing her mother's notebook, searching for guidance in Elizabeth's careful observations about navigating palace politics while maintaining personal integrity. Clarence House felt different as she prepared for what might be the most important meeting of her royal career. The building seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls understood that today's discussions could reshape decades of careful protocol. Margaret entered with an unusual expression, part concern, part excitement. Your Royal Highness, the veterans have arrived. All 12 of them. They've come together, and felt her eyebrows rise. She had expected individual meetings, perhaps small groups. Having all 12 speakers arrive simultaneously suggested a level of organization that impressed and slightly worried her. They came together? Yes, ma'am. They've apparently been in communication since your individual meetings. Colonel Harrison says they have a unified proposal to present, and straightened her shoulders, feeling the weight of her mother's pearl earrings and the military brooch that had become her talisman through this crisis. Very well. Show them to the main drawing room. This clearly requires space for proper discussion. The drawing room at Clarence House had hosted countless diplomatic meetings over the decades, but and doubted it had ever witnessed anything quite like this gathering. 12 military veterans from 7 different Commonwealth nations sat around the polished mahogany table with the bearing of people accustomed to serious discussions about life and death matters. Colonel Harrison rose as and entered, his Welsh guards training evident in his perfect posture despite his age. The others followed suit, a symphony of clicking heels and straightening spines that spoke to decades of military discipline. Your Royal Highness, thank you for agreeing to meet with us collectively, Harrison began. We've been discussing the situation extensively, and we've reached some conclusions we'd like to share, and gestured for them to be seated, noting the careful way they had arranged themselves around the table. This wasn't a casual gathering. They had clearly planned their seating, their presentation, possibly even their talking points. Please speak freely. I'm anxious to hear your thoughts. Sergeant Major Williams, the Canadian veteran she had met first, placed a folder on the table. Ma'am, we've done some research into royal protocols surrounding ceremonial events. We've also consulted with our respective veteran organizations back home and felt a flutter of surprise. These men and women hadn't simply accepted her explanations. They had conducted their own investigation into the situation. What did you discover? We discovered that this isn't the first time veteran voices have been marginalized for the sake of palace convenience, said Captain Sarah Mitchell from the Royal Australian Navy, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being heard. We've spoken with veteran organizations that have experienced similar treatment over the past 2 years. The revelation hit, and like a cold wave. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. What sort of similar treatment? Colonel Harrison opened the folder and withdrew several documents. Veteran memorial services shortened without consultation. Military charity events redesigned to emphasize royal presence over veteran recognition. Speaking opportunities reduced or eliminated entirely. Flight Lieutenant James McLeod from the Royal Air Force leaned forward. Ma'am, we serve in conflicts across the globe. We understand chain of command, we respect authority, and we know how to follow orders. But we also know when we're being dismissed rather than led. And felt her breath catch. These veterans weren't just defending their speaking opportunities. They were revealing systemic disrespect for their community's voice within royal engagements. Are you saying there's been a deliberate pattern of reducing veteran participation in royal ceremonies? We're saying that someone has decided veteran stories are less important than photo opportunities, replied Major Patricia O'Brien from the Irish Defence Forces, her tone carrying the bluntness of someone who had seen too much politics in her military career. Warrant Officer David Singh from the Royal Canadian Air Force added, We've tracked the changes, ma'am. Since Queen Camilla began taking a more active role in ceremonial planning, veteran speaking time has been reduced by an average of 60% across all major events. The number landed with devastating clarity, and realized she had been focused on this single ceremony while missing a much larger pattern of marginalization. Why hasn't this been reported through proper channels? Captain Mitchell's expression darkened slightly. It has been, ma'am. Multiple veteran organizations have submitted formal complaints through the Palace Correspondence Office. None have received responses, and felt something cold settle in her stomach. If these complaints had been filed and ignored, it meant either the system was fundamentally broken or someone was deliberately suppressing veteran concerns. Do you have copies of these complaints? We do. Harrison withdrew another set of documents from the folder. 17 formal complaints over the past 18 months. All properly formatted, all submitted through correct channels, all unanswered. And reviewed the documents with growing horror. The complaints detailed exactly what the veterans had told her. Reduced speaking time, eliminated presentations, veteran perspectives diminished in favor of royal protocol and media considerations. The pattern was undeniable and deeply disturbing. What are you proposing we do about this situation? The 12 veterans exchanged glances, and since they had rehearsed this moment, Colonel Harrison spoke for the group. Ma'am, we've discussed this extensively. We believe it's time for veteran organizations across the Commonwealth to make their voices heard directly. What does that mean, practically speaking? Flight Lieutenant McLeod answered. We're proposing to hold our own ceremony, ma'am. A veteran-organized event that honors our fallen comrades properly, with the full presentations we've prepared and the dignity our service members deserve. And felt her heart skip a beat. A separate ceremony? Independent of the palace event? Yes, ma'am. Major O'Brien confirmed. We've already spoken with our respective veteran organizations. There's strong support for an alternative event that focuses on honoring service rather than satisfying media schedules. Warrant Officer Singh added, "We're not doing this to embarrass anyone, Your Royal Highness. We're doing this because our stories matter, our fallen comrades deserve proper recognition, and we refuse to be silenced for convenience." And sat back in her chair, processing the magnitude of what they were proposing. A veteran-organized ceremony would send a powerful message about the palace's treatment of military communities. It would also likely trigger a significant political crisis within the royal family. Have you considered the implications of such an action? The media coverage, the questions it would raise about royal priorities? Captain Mitchell's expression was resolute. "Ma'am, we spent our careers serving something larger than ourselves. We faced enemy fire, endured separations from family, and lost friends to protect the values we believe in. We're not about to let those sacrifices be diminished by palace politics." Colonel Harrison leaned forward. "Your Royal Highness, we want to ask you something directly. If we organize this alternative ceremony, would you consider attending as our guest?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and realized they were asking her to choose, not just between competing ceremonies, but between institutional loyalty and personal principle, between palace protocols and veteran respect. That would be an extraordinary step, and said carefully. It could be seen as directly challenging royal authority, or it could be seen as supporting the people you spent your career serving, replied Sergeant Major Williams quietly, and found herself thinking of her mother's notebook, of Elizabeth's observations about choosing battles worth fighting. She thought of the countless veteran families she had met, the promises she had made, the trust she had built over decades of military engagement. "I need to understand something," and said finally, "Are you absolutely certain about moving forward with an independent ceremony? The palace will likely view this as a direct challenge to royal authority." "Ma'am," Flight Lieutenant McLeod replied, "we've been discussing that very question. We believe the palace has already challenged us by dismissing our voices. We're simply responding." Major O'Brien added, "We're not anti-monarchy, Your Royal Highness. We're pro-dignity. We're pro-respect for service. We're pro-keeping promises made to military families." And felt a sudden clarity cutting through weeks of confusion and frustration. These veterans weren't asking her to choose sides in a palace dispute. They were asking her to honor the commitment she had made to their community. What would this alternative ceremony look like? Colonel Harrison's eyes brightened with the enthusiasm of someone presenting a carefully planned operation. "We've already identified a venue. The Imperial War Museum has offered their auditorium. We would have the full program as originally planned, with each Commonwealth nation represented, all 12 veteran speakers, and the complete musical tributes." The response from veteran organizations has been overwhelming, Captain Mitchell added. "We're looking at attendance from military families across the Commonwealth, retired service members, active duty personnel on leave. This could be the largest veteran-organized ceremony in recent history." Warrant Officer Singh produced another document. "We've also received offers of support from military charities, veteran service organizations, and even some active duty units. Ma'am, the military community has been waiting for someone to stand up for their voices," and realized she was witnessing something unprecedented. Not just veteran organization, but veteran mobilization. These 12 speakers had become catalysts for a much larger movement. "When would you hold this ceremony?" "The same day as the palace event," Major O'Brien replied without hesitation. "We believe it's important to demonstrate that there are different ways to honor service, different priorities in how we remember our fallen." The implications were staggering. 2 competing ceremonies on the same day would create exactly the kind of public attention that palace officials desperately tried to avoid. It would raise questions about royal priorities, veteran treatment, and institutional respect for military service. And stood and walked to the window overlooking the gardens where she had spent so many hours contemplating difficult decisions. The autumn light filtered through the remaining leaves, creating patterns of shadow and illumination that seemed to mirror her internal struggle. Behind her, the veterans waited patiently. These were people accustomed to military decision-making processes, understanding that important choices required time and careful consideration. When Anne turned back to face them, she saw not just 12 individuals, but representatives of a community that had trusted her for decades. She saw the faces of every veteran she had visited in hospitals, every military family she had comforted, every service member she had promised would never be forgotten. "I have one question for you," and said finally. "If I attend your ceremony, if I openly support veteran voices over palace protocols, are you prepared for the consequences? The media attention, the political fallout, the potential damage to all of our reputations." Colonel Harrison stood, and the others followed. "Your Royal Highness, we've already faced the worst things life can offer. We've lost friends to war, endured physical and emotional wounds, and spent years rebuilding our lives after service. Palace politics don't frighten us. And if the royal family never forgives this challenge to their authority," Sergeant Major Williams answered, "Ma'am, with respect, we're not doing this for the royal family's approval. We're doing this because it's right," and felt something settle inside her, a peace that came from knowing what choice she had to make, regardless of its consequences. She thought of her mother's words about the crown's honor being measured by faithfulness to those who trust us. "Very well," and said, her voice carrying a certainty that surprised even her. "I'll attend your ceremony. But I want to be clear about something. I won't just attend as your guest. I want to speak at your ceremony. I want to explain to the military community why their voices matter and why keeping faith with them is more important than palace convenience." The silence that followed was profound. Then Colonel Harrison stepped forward and offered a military salute. Not the casual acknowledgement typically given to royalty, but the sharp, precise salute reserved for commanding officers who had earned absolute respect. One by one, the other veterans followed suit, and found herself receiving honors from people who had chosen to trust her with their most important mission, ensuring that their fallen comrades would be remembered with dignity. As the veterans filed out of Clarence House that afternoon, and knew there was no turning back, she had committed herself to a course of action that would likely trigger the biggest royal crisis of her lifetime. But for the first time in weeks, she felt completely certain that she had made the right choice. The news reached King Charles at precisely 11:15 on a Thursday morning, delivered through the elaborate communication channels that connected the various royal households. His private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, entered the king's study at Highgrove with the careful demeanor of someone bearing potentially explosive information. Charles looked up from his correspondence, immediately noting the tension in Sir Clive's expression. After decades of royal service, he had learned to read the subtle signals that preceded difficult conversations. "Sir Clive, you look as though you're bearing news I'd rather not hear." "I'm afraid so, Your Majesty. We've received reports about Princess Anne's activities regarding the veterans' ceremony." Charles set down his fountain pen and gave Sir Clive his full attention. The situation with Anne and Camilla had been troubling him for weeks, though he had hoped it might resolve itself through normal diplomatic channels. "What sort of reports?" Sir Clive consulted his notes with the precision that had made him indispensable to the royal household. "Princess Anne has apparently been meeting individually with all 12 veteran speakers originally scheduled for the ceremony. Our sources indicate these weren't courtesy calls. They were detailed briefings about internal palace disagreements." Charles felt his stomach tighten. "She discussed internal family matters with outside parties?" "It appears so, sir. Furthermore, the veterans have now organized an alternative ceremony for the same day as the official palace event. Princess Anne has reportedly agreed to attend and speak at this alternative gathering. The magnitude of what Sir Clive was describing hit Charles like a physical blow. In nearly 2 years as king, he had never faced a direct challenge to royal authority from within his own family. This went beyond simple disagreement. It approached open rebellion. Are you certain about this information? Multiple sources have confirmed the details, sir. The veterans have secured the Imperial War Museum as their venue. Military organizations across the Commonwealth are supporting the event. Media inquiries are already beginning. Charles rose from his desk and walked to the window overlooking the gardens where he found so much peace. The autumn landscape, with its mixture of vibrant colors and fallen leaves, seemed to mirror the complex emotions stirring within him. His relationship with and had always been complicated. She was undoubtedly the most dedicated working royal of her generation, but she had also inherited their mother's stubbornness and sense of duty that sometimes conflicted with palace pragmatism. Charles had always admired her integrity, even when it proved inconvenient. What does Camilla know about these developments? Her Majesty is aware of the situation, sir. She's requested a private meeting with you this afternoon to discuss the implications. Charles nodded slowly, understanding that this crisis would require careful navigation. Camilla's position as queen consort was still relatively new, her authority still being established. A public challenge from and could undermine years of careful relationship building with military communities and the broader public. Schedule the meeting with the queen consort for 3 o'clock. Also, I want to speak with Princess and directly. Arrange for her to come to Highgrove tomorrow morning. Sir, should the princess be informed about the purpose of the meeting? Charles considered the question carefully and deserved honesty about the seriousness of the situation, but he also needed her to come voluntarily rather than feeling summoned like a wayward child. Tell her I'd like to discuss the veterans' ceremony situation. Make it clear that this is a conversation between father and daughter, not a formal royal reprimand. That afternoon, Charles found himself in his private sitting room awaiting Camilla's arrival. The room held memories of countless family discussions, both joyful and difficult. Today it felt heavier, as if the very furniture understood the gravity of the approaching conversation. Camilla entered with her characteristic grace, but Charles immediately noticed the strain in her expression. The past few weeks had clearly taken their toll, and he felt a surge of protective instinct for the woman who had supported him through his most challenging periods. Charles, thank you for agreeing to meet, Camilla said as she settled into the chair opposite him. This situation has become more serious than we initially realized. So I've been told. A competing ceremony on the same day as our official event. Camilla's expression darkened. It's worse than that. We're receiving reports that veteran organizations are actively choosing the alternative ceremony over the palace event. This could be deeply embarrassing for the monarchy. Charles studied his wife's face, noting the genuine concern beneath her diplomatic composure. Tell me your perspective on how this situation developed. Charles, you know how much I respect Anne's dedication to military causes. But her approach to this ceremony was becoming problematic. The original program was simply too long, too detailed for modern attention spans. I suggested reasonable modifications to improve the event's impact. And Anne's response? She became defensive, almost possessive of the planning process. She seemed to view any suggestions as personal attacks rather than collaborative improvements. Charles listened carefully, recognizing that multiple perspectives could exist within the same set of facts. His experience as heir apparent had taught him that palace disagreements often involve sincere people reaching different conclusions about the same situation. What specific changes did you propose? Camilla produced a folder from her bag. Reducing the number of veteran speakers from 12 to 4, streamlining the Commonwealth nation presentations, and adjusting the leadership structure to reflect current royal hierarchies. Adjusting the leadership structure? Charles, as queen consort, I should be taking the primary role in major ceremonial events. Anne's position as ceremony organizer was creating confusion about royal precedents. Charles felt the complexity of the situation settling around him like fog. Both women had valid points. Camilla about establishing her role and about honoring commitments to veterans. But the solution they had chosen was creating a much larger problem. Have you considered that and might have made specific commitments to these veterans? Personal promises about their participation? Camilla's expression shifted slightly. I'm sure she meant well, but sometimes personal promises must be balanced against broader institutional needs. And the press coverage suggesting and was being difficult? How did reporters obtain such detailed information about internal discussions? For the first time, Camilla looked uncomfortable. The media has many sources, Charles. It's impossible to control how information reaches the press. Charles recognized the evasion, but chose not to press immediately. He needed to understand the full situation before addressing specific concerns about information management. What outcome are you hoping for from my conversation with Anne? I hope she can be made to understand that challenging royal decisions publicly undermines all of our authority. This alternative ceremony makes the monarchy look divided and ineffective. That evening, Charles found himself unable to focus on his usual reading. The situation with and Camilla represented exactly the kind of internal conflict he had hoped to avoid as king. His mother had always managed to maintain family unity while preserving institutional dignity, but Elizabeth had possessed decades of experience and unquestioned authority. The next morning brought into Highgrove with characteristic punctuality. Charles watched from his study window as her car approached, noting her straight posture even through the vehicle's windows. She emerged wearing her navy suit and military brooch, a combination that had become her armor during this crisis. Margaret accompanied, but Charles had requested a private conversation, so she was escorted to a separate reception room while father and daughter met alone, and entered Charles's study with the bearing of someone prepared for battle, but hoping for understanding. The autumn morning light streaming through the windows highlighted the strain that recent weeks had etched around her eyes. "Father," and said simply, offering a slight curtsy that felt more like courtesy than submission. "And thank you for coming. Please sit down. We have much to discuss." They settled into the comfortable chairs near the fireplace, the same seats where Charles had often sought his mother's guidance during his own periods of uncertainty. "I assume this is about the veterans' ceremony," and said directly, "Indeed it is. I've been briefed about your alternative event, your meetings with the veteran speakers, your decision to challenge the official palace ceremony." Anne's expression remained calm, but determined. "I wouldn't characterize it as challenging the palace. I would describe it as honoring commitments made to people who deserve respect." Charles felt himself caught between admiration for his daughter's principles and concern about her methods. "And you've created a public relations crisis. Two competing royal ceremonies on the same day will generate exactly the kind of negative media attention we try to avoid. Then, perhaps the palace should have considered that before dismissing veteran voices for media convenience." The sharpness in Anne's tone surprised Charles. His daughter was typically more diplomatic in family discussions, even when strongly disagreeing. "Tell me your perspective on what happened. Help me understand how we reached this point." For the next hour, Anne detailed her version of events, the months of planning, the personal relationships built with veteran communities, the specific promises made to military families, and the sudden pressure to abandon all of that for what she saw as superficial improvements. Charles listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly allowing Anne to present her case fully. When she finished, he found himself facing a dilemma that struck at the heart of modern monarchy. "And I understand your frustration, but you must see that publicly challenging Camilla's authority undermines her position as queen consort." "Father, I'm not challenging Camilla's authority. I'm defending the integrity of promises made to military families. If those two things are in conflict, perhaps we need to examine our priorities." Charles felt the weight of his position acutely. As king, he needed to support his queen consort's authority. As a father, he admired his daughter's integrity. As someone who had spent decades building relationships with military communities, he understood the importance of keeping faith with veterans. What would it take to resolve this situation? Is there a way to honor your commitments to the veterans while maintaining family unity? N's expression softened slightly. Father, I've already committed to speaking at the veterans ceremony. I've looked these people in the eye and promised them that their voices matter more than palace politics. I can't break that faith, even if it means openly contradicting royal authority, even if it means choosing veterans over protocols. Charles realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in his experience, a member of his family choosing external loyalty over internal harmony. It was both admirable and terrifying. And you understand the consequences of this choice? The media coverage, the questions about family unity, the potential damage to the monarchy's reputation. I understand the consequences of both choices, Father. The consequences of abandoning these veterans seem far worse than the consequences of disappointing palace officials. Charles stood and walked to his desk, where a photograph of his mother in military dress uniform reminded him of the royal family's deep connections to military service. Elizabeth had always prioritized duty above comfort, service above convenience. When he turned back to face, and Charles felt a clarity that surprised him. Very well. If you're committed to this course of action, then we need to manage the situation properly. N's eyebrows rose slightly. What do you mean? I mean that if the Princess Royal is going to publicly support veteran voices, then her position should be clearly understood. This isn't a family rebellion. This is a disagreement about royal priorities. Father, are you saying you support my decision? Charles felt the weight of kingship settling around him like a familiar cloak. I'm saying that I've spent my entire life learning about duty, service, and keeping faith with those who trust the crown. Your mother taught me that sometimes the most difficult choices are also the most important ones. The conversation that followed would reshape the royal family's approach to military engagements for years to come. Charles and spent the remainder of the morning developing a strategy that would honor veteran commitments while preserving institutional dignity. When Anne left Highgrove that afternoon, she carried with her something unprecedented: her father's explicit support for challenging palace authority when that authority conflicted with deeper principles of service and honor. Charles watched her departure from his study window, knowing that he had just made one of the most significant decisions of his reign. Then, he reached for his phone to call Camilla, understanding that the most difficult conversation was yet to come. The veterans ceremony would proceed as planned, with Princess Anne as the featured speaker. But, more importantly, King Charles had chosen to prioritize veteran voices over palace politics, setting a precedent that would define his approach to the complex balance between institutional authority and moral obligation. The battle for the ceremony had been won, but the larger questions it raised about royal priorities, family loyalty, and institutional integrity would continue to resonate throughout the kingdom for years to come.